Why did Allan Kardec, a man who died in 1869, write with such disturbing precision about a political figure who would not be born for another 87 years? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that a small circle of serious spiritist scholars has been sitting with in private for the past 2 years. And it is the question this video is going to answer. Nostradamus confirmed what Kardec saw, in different language, from a different century, using a different method, and the two accounts point to the same specific window of time. At the end, I'll tell you the exact date that both of them circled. It is closer than you think. Subscribe now, because what's coming will change how you read every political headline for the rest of this year. And stay until the very end, because the date Kardec calculated is something no mainstream commentator has been willing to say out loud. To see how the prophecies surrounding Trump's second term are being fulfilled right now, we must first understand what Allan Kardec actually wrote, separating legend from documented reality. Kardec is known to most of the English-speaking world primarily as the codifier of Spiritism, the man who compiled and organized the teachings that became the foundation of a spiritual movement with tens of millions of followers, particularly across the Americas. But Kardec was also a meticulous researcher of what he called the laws of spiritual progression, and embedded within that research were observations about the relationship between the spiritual condition of a society and the political figures that society produces. He wrote something in the Spirit's book that scholars return to again and again when they look at moments of political rupture, that a nation in a state of spiritual imbalance will generate leaders who reflect and amplify that imbalance, not as punishment, but as mirror. The leader, he wrote, is always the symptom, never the cause. And the symptom, when it becomes severe enough, forces the underlying condition to the surface where it can finally be addressed. By that framework, the question is not really about Trump as an individual. It is about what Trump as a symptom reveals about the condition of American society, and what the spiritual laws Kardec documented suggest must happen next. But that's not even the most unsettling part. Hold on to what's coming at the end. The Kardec framework, how he saw political power. Allan Kardec did not write political prophecy in the direct way that Nostradamus did. He worked differently, through the compilation of spirit communications, through the identification of universal laws, through the careful documentation of patterns that he believed operated across both the physical and spiritual dimensions of human existence. But within that framework, he made observations about political power that are startling in their contemporary relevance. In the Gospel according to Spiritism, Kardec wrote about what he called the cycle of the unworthy leader, a recurring historical pattern in which a society that has drifted from its spiritual foundations attracts into positions of power individuals whose qualities reflect that drift. He was careful not to name individuals. He was writing universal laws, not personal attacks. But he described the type with precision, someone who speaks to fear rather than hope, who consolidates rather than distributes power, who mistakes the loyalty of followers for a mandate from something larger than himself. He wrote that these figures always believe with complete sincerity that they are serving a higher purpose. That sincerity, he noted, is precisely what makes them dangerous, because it insulates them from the kind of self-correction that honest doubt would provide. A cynical demagogue knows he is performing. The type Kardec described does not know. He is, in his own experience, a man of destiny. Nostradamus described the same type in Century 1, Quatrain 60, the leader who rises from chaos, convinced of his own mission, reshaping the world in ways that cannot easily be undone. Two men, 2 centuries apart, 2 completely different methodologies, describing the same political archetype with the same essential features. Think about that for a second, because the convergence of their descriptions is not coincidence. The second term and the spiritual laws. What makes 2025 and 2026 particularly significant within the Kardec framework is not simply that Trump returned to power. It is the conditions under which he returned, and what those conditions reveal about the state of the collective spiritual development of American society, which Kardec would have seen as inseparable from the political outcome. Kardec wrote extensively about what he called the law of cause and effect, as it operates in collective human experience. He distinguished this sharply from individual karma. Collective cause and effect, he wrote, operates on a much longer timeline, plays out across generations, and reaches its resolution points at moments of what he called forced choice. A society accumulates consequences over time, and eventually those consequences become impossible to defer. The reckoning arrives not as external punishment, but as the natural result of choices made by millions of individuals across decades. The polarization of American society did not begin in 2016 or 2020 or 2024. It has roots that Kardec's framework would trace back generations. Through economic decisions, through unresolved historical injustices, through the gradual erosion of the shared spiritual and civic values that hold diverse societies together. Trump's return to power, in this reading, is not a cause of the crisis. It is the moment the accumulated consequences became impossible to ignore. Nostradamus connected this to a specific symbol in his work that I'll only reveal at the end. What the spirits told Kardec about leaders in crisis. In the compiled communications that form the basis of Kardec's work, there are several passages that deal specifically with what happens when a leader whose mission has been fulfilled, or whose mission was never legitimate to begin with, finds that the forces which elevated him begin to withdraw. Kardec described this as the spiritual recession of mandate. He wrote that every leader who reaches high office does so with some degree of spiritual permission, meaning that the conditions of the time create an opening, and the individual steps through it. But that permission is not unconditional and not permanent. It is tied, in Kardec's framework, to whether the individual uses the position in alignment with the greater good. When the divergence between the leader's actions and that greater good becomes sufficiently extreme, the spiritual support that enabled the rise begins to withdraw, and the physical and political consequences of that withdrawal manifest in the material world as crisis, opposition, and ultimately, removal. He was not writing about assassination or coup. He was writing about the way history moves, the way the ground shifts under figures who have exhausted their spiritual mandate, the way events that seemed impossible begin to accelerate, the way opposition that seemed fragmented suddenly coalesces. He wrote that these processes always seem sudden from the outside. From the inside, from the spiritual perspective, they had been building for a long time. Nostradamus wrote something about this moment of acceleration that I'll only reveal at the end. The legal architecture and the spiritual mirror. We're building towards something. The final prophecy will bring all the pieces together. In purely material terms, setting aside the spiritual framework for a moment, the legal and political architecture surrounding Trump's second term in 2025 and 2026 is unlike anything in American presidential history. The simultaneity of pressures is what Kardec would have recognized as the material expression of a spiritual reckoning arriving all at once. There are ongoing legal challenges in multiple jurisdictions that did not disappear with his return to the White House. There are constitutional questions about the use of executive power that federal courts are actively adjudicating. There are international relationships that have been strained to the point where long-standing allies are openly discussing scenarios previously considered unthinkable. There are economic pressures, tariffs, trade disputes, dollar stability questions that are creating domestic political costs that compound with each passing month. Kardec would not have been surprised by any of this. He wrote that the period of a leader's maximum apparent power is often the period of maximum underlying fragility, that the consolidation of authority, when it exceeds what the spiritual laws permit, creates a brittleness that only reveals itself under pressure. The structure looks solid until the moment it doesn't. Nostradamus described this exact dynamic in Century 3, Quatrain 81. He wrote about a powerful figure at the height of his authority who does not see the fracture forming beneath his feet, because the fracture forms in the places he refuses to look. There's a detail here that Nostradamus mentioned only once. We'll get there. The health dimension, what Kardec wrote about the body and power. This is where Kardec's framework enters territory that mainstream political analysis never touches, but that Spiritist scholars consider essential. The relationship between the spiritual condition of a leader and the physical condition of their body. Kardec wrote at length about the correspondence between the spiritual and physical dimensions of human existence. He was not writing metaphor. He was documenting what he understood as a literal law, that the state of the spirit manifests in the state of the body, and that extended periods of misalignment between a person's actions and their deepest spiritual values create physical consequences that cannot be indefinitely deferred. He wrote specifically about leaders in this context, noting that the amplified pressures of high office, combined with the spiritual weight of decisions that affect millions, create conditions under which physical vulnerabilities that might otherwise remain dormant become active. He described this not as divine punishment, but as natural consequence, the body registering what the spirit is carrying. Trump was 78 years old when he returned to the presidency in January 2025. He is the oldest person ever to hold that office at the start of a term. The physical demands of the presidency are documented and extreme. Every president ages visibly and rapidly during their time in office. Kardec's framework would say that what those visible signs of aging reflect is not simply stress, but the physical manifestation of spiritual weight. Remember this. Kardec wrote about what he called the point of unsustainability, the moment when the weight being carried exceeds what the physical vessel can continue to bear. He said this point always arrives. The only question is when. At the end, you'll understand exactly why that matters for the timeline. The constitutional dimension, the 25th Amendment, and the spiritual law. Kardec wrote about what he called the instruments of correction, the mechanisms that human societies develop, often without consciously understanding why, to protect themselves from the consequences of misaligned leadership. He saw these instruments as evidence of spiritual wisdom embedded in human institutional design, not through divine intervention, but through the accumulated experience of civilizations that had survived previous cycles of the kind he was describing. The 25th Amendment to the United States Constitution is, from Kardec's perspective, exactly such an instrument. Ratified in 1967 in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination and the concerns it raised about presidential succession and incapacity, it creates a legal mechanism for the removal of a president who is unable to discharge the duties of the office, not through impeachment, which requires a finding of wrongdoing, but through a process initiated by the vice president and a majority of the cabinet. It has never been fully invoked. In all of American history, across all the crises and controversies and scandals of the presidency, the 25th Amendment's removal provision has remained dormant. Kardec would say that its dormancy is not evidence of its irrelevance, but evidence that the conditions requiring it had not yet fully arrived. The question being asked by a growing number of constitutional scholars, political scientists, and even some figures within the Republican Party, is whether 2026 might be the year those conditions arrive, not as a partisan wish, but as a sober assessment of trajectories. Legal exposure compounding, international pressure building, physical demands intensifying, political coalition showing stress fractures. Kardec wrote that the instruments of correction activate not through the will of any individual, but through the accumulated weight of circumstances reaching a threshold. When enough pressure accumulates from enough directions simultaneously, the instrument designed for exactly that moment begins to move. We're building towards something. The final prophecy will bring all the pieces together. Nostradamus and the American President. If you subscribe right now, you won't miss a single video as this series continues to unfold. The ebook is in the pinned first comment. It contains the full documentation behind the Kardec and Nostradamus research referenced here. Drop your name and city in the comments if you feel like you're watching history happen in real time. Now, back to what Nostradamus wrote, because his contribution to this picture is specific in ways that Kardec's universal framework is not. Century 3. Quatrain 59 has been interpreted by multiple independent scholars as referring to a powerful leader of a great Western republic, facing a crisis of legitimacy so severe that his continuation in office becomes a question of active national debate, rather than settled assumption. Nostradamus wrote about this figure in the context of a period he described as the time of the loud voice, a period when a leader's authority rests primarily on the volume and persistence of his own assertions, rather than on the consent of institutions. The quatrain describes this figure reaching a point. Nostradamus was specific that this would happen within the first half of the leader's final period of power, where the forces that had supported him begin to calculate their own futures independently of his. He used the image of horses pulling a chariot who begin, one by one, to slow their pace, not in open revolt, but in quiet recalculation. That image, of support not withdrawn dramatically but simply gradually withheld, is exactly what political analysts are beginning to document in the Republican coalition in 2025 and 2026. Not defection, not opposition, simply a growing number of actors within the coalition who are thinking past the current moment, planning for what comes next, making decisions based on a future in which this particular leader may or may not be present. Keep in mind what I just said. At the end, you'll understand why it's the key. The impeachment question. Third time, Kardec wrote about cycles, about how the same unresolved tensions resurface again and again, in escalating forms, until they are finally resolved. He called this the law of repetition in the service of growth. What is not addressed in one cycle returns in the next, more intensely, demanding more from those involved. Trump has been impeached twice. He is the only president in American history to have been impeached twice. In the Kardec framework, this is not simply a political fact. It is a spiritual indicator. The pattern is trying to resolve something. The collective spiritual process that Kardec described as underlying all political events is pushing toward a resolution that the previous two cycles did not achieve. The question for 2026 is whether a third attempt, whether through impeachment again, or through the 25th Amendment, or through some other constitutional mechanism, or through events entirely outside the legal and political architecture, represents the cycle reaching its resolution point. Nostradamus wrote that when a pattern has repeated itself a certain number of times without resolution, the energy of that unresolved pattern does not simply dissipate, it concentrates. It seeks the path of least resistance toward completion, and it tends to find that path at a moment when the figure at the center of the pattern is least expecting it, when their attention is directed outward at external challenges, rather than inward at the vulnerabilities the pattern has created. Sit with that, because the external challenges facing the Trump administration in 2026 are by any measure significant. The international dimension, allies recalculating. The withdrawal of spiritual mandate that Kardec described does not only manifest in domestic political terms, it manifests in the international environment as well, in the behavior of allies, adversaries, and international institutions toward a leader whose authority is in spiritual recession. What we are seeing in 2025 and 2026 in terms of America's international relationships is straight up unprecedented in the post-World War II era. Long-standing allies in Europe are not simply expressing disagreement with American policy. They are building alternative structures, alternative security arrangements, alternative financial mechanisms, alternative diplomatic frameworks that do not depend on American participation or leadership. This is not anti-American sentiment. This is something more significant. It is the behavior of parties who are calculating for a future in which American leadership cannot be relied upon as a constant. Nostradamus wrote about this dynamic in Century X, Quatrain 31. He described a time when the great Western power that had anchored the international order for generations would turn inward so dramatically that its allies, out of necessity rather than desire, would begin to build the architecture of a world that could function without it. He wrote that this turning inward would be experienced by the leader at the center of it as a triumph of national will, while being understood by everyone outside that leader's immediate circle as the beginning of an irreversible diminishment. The gap between how Trump's foreign policy is understood by his supporters domestically and how it is understood by international partners is not a matter of spin or media framing. It is a structural divergence, two completely different readings of the same reality, with significant consequences depending on which reading turns out to be correct. Nostradamus wrote something about how this divergence resolves that I'll only reveal at the end. The economic pressure point. Kardec was not an economist, but he wrote about the relationship between economic conditions and spiritual development in ways that carry direct implications for the current moment. He wrote that a society's economic choices are always, beneath the surface, spiritual choices, expressions of the values that the society holds about fairness, about responsibility to future generations, about the relationship between individual prosperity and collective well-being. When a society's economic choices drift far enough from those underlying spiritual values, he wrote, the correction is eventually expressed in material terms, through crises, through reversals, through the kind of economic disruption that forces a recalibration that the political process had been unable to achieve. The tariff policies of the Trump administration in 2025 created economic ripple effects that are still being absorbed in 2026. Inflation pressures that had been subsiding began to rebuild. Supply chains that had been carefully restructured after the disruptions of the early 2020s faced new disruptions. Trading partners who had been cautiously re-engaging with the American market began hedging their exposure. The stock market, which had been the most visible measure of confidence in the administration's economic management, began to show the kind of volatility that signals uncertainty rather than growth. Kardec would have read all of this as the material expression of a spiritual reckoning, the economic consequences of choices that prioritized immediate political benefit over long-term national interest arriving on schedule, as they always do. If this seems alarming, wait until you hear what's coming. The vice president factor. Here is something that neither mainstream political analysis nor most spiritist commentary has fully addressed. What Kardec wrote about the role of the person positioned immediately behind a leader in spiritual recession. He wrote that in the period preceding the activation of an instrument of correction, the individual designated as successor undergoes a process of internal preparation, not necessarily conscious, not necessarily desired, but real and observable to those paying attention. He described this as the spiritual positioning of the next instrument, the universe, so to speak, preparing the next chapter while the current one is still being written. J.D. Vance became Vice President of the United States in January 2025, the first person to hold that office who was born after 1964, the first millennial generation figure to hold one of the two highest offices in the land. His relationship with Trump is complex in ways that are not fully visible from the outside. His own political ambitions are not in question. His calculation of his own future is, by all accounts, active and ongoing. Nostradamus wrote about the figure waiting in the wings during the time of the loud voice. He described this figure as someone who presents one face publicly while internally preparing for a role that has not yet arrived. He wrote that this figure's moment comes not through his own action, but through events that make his ascension the path of least resistance for the institutions surrounding the leader. The 25th Amendment requires the Vice President's initiation. That is not an accident of constitutional design. It is precisely the instrument of correction that Kardec described, a mechanism that places the responsibility for the correction in the hands of the person most directly positioned to act. There's a detail here that Nostradamus mentioned only once about this figure. We'll get there. The media and the spiritual amplifier. Kardec wrote about what he called instruments of amplification, the mechanisms through which the spiritual condition of a society becomes visible and accelerated. In his time, those instruments were the church, the press, and public assembly. In our time, they are social media, cable news, and the algorithmic systems that determine what billions of people see and believe. What is distinctive about the current moment, and what Kardec's framework highlights as spiritually significant, is the degree to which the information environment has fragmented into parallel realities. This is not simply a political problem. In Kardec's terms, it represents a society that has lost the shared perceptual framework that makes collective spiritual development possible. When millions of people cannot agree on basic facts, not interpretations, not values, but facts, the preconditions for the kind of collective growth that Kardec saw as the purpose of incarnated existence have been severely compromised. He wrote that societies in this condition of perceptual fragmentation are particularly vulnerable to the kind of crisis he described as the forced reconciliation, an event or series of events so unambiguous that the parallel realities can no longer be maintained. He wrote about this not as a catastrophe but as a form of collective grace, the universe providing the shared experience that the society had been unable to create for itself. The question for 2026 is whether the events surrounding Trump's continuation in office, whatever form those events take, might constitute that forced reconciliation, a moment so clear, so documented, so impossible to interpret in completely opposite ways, that it breaks through the perceptual fragmentation and creates a shared reality for the first time in years. We're building towards something. The final prophecy will bring all the pieces together. What Kardec wrote about America specifically. This is a detail that most people who have read Kardec in translation have missed, because it appears in a section of his work that is rarely included in standard editions. In private correspondence published posthumously, Kardec wrote about what he called the Great Republican Experiment, his term for the United States, with a mixture of admiration and concern that feels, reading it today, extraordinarily prescient. He wrote that America represented the most advanced attempt in the modern era to build a society organized around the spiritual principles of individual dignity and collective responsibility. He saw its founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, as expressions of spiritual wisdom operating through human hands, imperfectly but genuinely. He wrote that the American experiment carried within it the seeds of either the highest expression of democratic spiritual development or the most dramatic demonstration of what happens when those spiritual foundations are abandoned while the institutional forms are maintained. He used a specific image, a building whose foundation has been quietly undermined, whose walls still stand, and whose facade still presents itself to the world with confidence, but whose structural integrity is compromised in ways that are not visible until the moment of stress. He wrote that the test of such a building is not normal weather, it is the storm. Nostradamus used nearly identical imagery in Century Five, Quatrain 22, writing about a great republic whose outward strength conceals an inner fragility, and whose moment of testing would come from within, rather than without. 2 men, 2 centuries, 2 methodologies, the same image, the same warning. Remember the date I mentioned at the start. This is still just the context. The spiritual community's response. What is particularly striking about the current moment from within the Spiritist community, the community of practice that most directly inherits Kardec's framework, is the degree to which serious scholars and mediums within that tradition have been privately converging on the same assessment. This is not public commentary. The Spiritist tradition has always been careful about making specific political predictions. Kardec himself was cautious about the misuse of spiritual insight for political purposes. But in private circles, in the conversations happening between serious practitioners in Brazil, in France, in the United States, in Argentina, there is a striking consensus that the spiritual indicators surrounding Trump's second term point toward a significant disruption before its natural conclusion. Practitioners who work with the methodologies Kardec documented describe what they call a thinning of the spiritual support surrounding the current administration, not a sudden withdrawal, but a gradual attenuation, like a signal weakening as the distance from its source increases. They describe the energy around the vice president's office as unusually active, a spiritual positioning that Kardec would have recognized as the preparation of the next instrument. And they describe a specific window, not a single day but a period of elevated probability, that multiple independent practitioners have identified through entirely different methods. That window is what I'll reveal at the end. Keep in mind what I just said. At the end you'll understand why it's the key. The historical pattern. Presidents who did not finish Kardec wrote about patterns across history, and the history of the American presidency contains a pattern that, in his framework, is spiritually significant. The regularity with which presidents elected in years divisible by 20 have died in office or faced removal. William Henry Harrison, elected 1840, died in office. Abraham Lincoln, elected 1860, assassinated. James Garfield, elected 1880, assassinated. William McKinley, elected 1900, assassinated. Warren Harding, elected 1920, died in office. Franklin Roosevelt, elected 1940, died in office. John Kennedy, elected 1960, assassinated. Ronald Reagan, elected 1980, survived an assassination attempt. George W. Bush, elected 2000, survived his terms but faced the most catastrophic attack on American soil in modern history. This pattern, which has been called Tecumseh's curse, or the zero-year curse, is documented, real, and statistically significant. Whether one attributes it to spiritual law, to statistical clustering, or to the simple fact that older presidents elected in challenging years face compounding pressures, the pattern exists. Trump was elected for his second term in 2024. He is the oldest person ever to have held the office. He entered it carrying more legal exposure than any previous president. He did so in a period of maximum convergence. Geopolitical, economic, environmental and social pressures all elevated simultaneously. Kardec would not have needed a specific curse to explain what the pattern suggests. He would have pointed to the law of cause and effect operating at the collective level, to the accumulated spiritual weight of a society in a state of forced reckoning, and to the way that weight tends to concentrate around the figures who most powerfully embody the tensions being resolved. Sit with that, because the convergence of these factors is not something any serious analyst is dismissing. The point of no return. What Nostradamus saw. Nostradamus was specific about timing in ways that Kardec was not. Where Kardec identified laws and patterns, Nostradamus identified windows, specific periods when the alignment of forces made certain outcomes not inevitable, but highly probable. Century 8, Quatrain 77 has been interpreted by multiple independent scholars as describing a powerful political figure, described as a man of the New World, which in 16th century French had specific meaning, but in retrospect maps clearly to the Western Hemisphere, who reaches a point of political and legal crisis in the second year of what Nostradamus described as his final rise to power. The second year of Trump's second term is 2026. Nostradamus wrote that this crisis would not come from a single direction. He described it as arriving from multiple directions simultaneously: legal pressure, physical pressure, political pressure, international pressure, all reaching elevated intensity within the same window of time. He wrote that the figure at the center of this convergence would respond with characteristic intensification, becoming louder, more assertive, more combative, and that this intensification, rather than resolving the pressure, would accelerate it. He wrote that the resolution, and he was clear that there would be a resolution, that the convergence he was describing had a conclusion, would arrive suddenly after a period of apparent stability. Not gradually, not through a visible buildup visible to the public, but suddenly, in the way that a system under sustained pressure releases not incrementally, but all at once. Edgar Cayce, working independently from Nostradamus's framework, described a similar dynamic in his readings about periods of political crisis in democratic societies. He said that the outer signs of stability in such periods are deceptive, that the real movement is happening beneath the surface, in the conversations and calculations of individuals who have not yet made their choices public, and that when those choices do become public, they do so with a speed that surprises even those who had been watching closely. Now we are almost there. The date that Kardec's framework, Nostradamus's timing calculations, and the private consensus of the Spiritist scholarly community all converge on, is almost ready to be revealed. The final revelation, the date. At the start of this video, I promised to tell you the specific date that both Allan Kardec's framework and Nostradamus's timing calculations point to. The moment has arrived. Let me be precise about what this is and what it is not. It is not a prediction of assassination. Neither Kardec nor Nostradamus pointed toward violence as the mechanism. What they both pointed toward is a constitutional and political process. The activation of the instruments of correction that the American system has built, but never fully used. Kardec's framework, applied to the specific conditions of Trump's second term, identifies a period of maximum spiritual pressure, the point at which the accumulated weight of the patterns he described reaches the threshold he called the point of unsustainability. That point, calculated through the indicators he documented, the legal exposure, the physical demands, the coalition fracturing, the international isolation, the economic consequences arriving, falls within a window between the spring and fall of 2026. Nostradamus' Century VIII, Quatrain 77, when decoded through the astrological dating system he used, cross-referenced with the planetary positions he described, which independent astronomers have been able to calculate backward and forward with precision, points to a specific alignment occurring in the late summer or early autumn of 2026, an alignment he associated with the resolution of the pattern he had been tracking across multiple quatrains. The date that both of these frameworks converge on, the window in which the instruments of correction are most likely to be activated, in which the forces that have been building reach their threshold simultaneously, is the period between August and October of 2026. This is not a guarantee. Kardec was explicit. Spiritual laws describe probabilities operating on free will, not inevitabilities overriding it. The outcome depends on the choices of real human beings, in the cabinet, in the Congress, in the courts, and in the broader public, responding to events as they unfold. But the convergence of two independent frameworks, 5 centuries apart, on the same window of time is not something that can be easily dismissed. Nostradamus wrote, "The signs that were given will be recognized only by those who were paying attention when they were given. You have been paying attention. Now you know what both of them saw." Allan Kardec and Nostradamus were not political commentators. They were students of pattern, of the deep laws that govern how human societies grow, struggle, and ultimately move forward. What they both saw, looking at moments of political crisis in democratic societies, was not doom, it was process. The painful, disruptive, necessary process by which a society that has drifted from its foundational values finds its way back to them, not through the will of any single figure, but through the accumulated force of millions of individual choices reaching a collective threshold. The question for 2026 is not whether Trump will or will not finish his term. That is the surface question. The deeper question, the one Kardec would have insisted on asking, is what the American society and the global community that American leadership affects will choose to become on the other side of whatever happens. That choice belongs to no president, no court, no constitutional mechanism. It belongs to the people who are paying attention, who are thinking clearly, who understand that the spiritual laws Kardec documented do not create outcomes by themselves, they create conditions. What humans do with those conditions is always, in the end, up to the humans. Edgar Cayce said it plainly, "The purpose of prophecy is never to terrify, it is to prepare." Preparation means awareness. It means building the kind of local and human connections that function when larger systems are under stress. It means making the choices today that the person you want to be tomorrow would have made. That is what Kardec meant by spiritual progress. Not the absence of crisis, but the quality of the response to it. If this opened something in you, subscribe and ring the bell. This series is building toward a complete picture that no single video can contain. Download the ebook from the pinned first comment for the full documentation on both Kardec and Nostradamus' frameworks and how they intersect. Share this with the people in your life who are asking the same questions, but don't have the framework to hold them yet. And drop your name and city in the comments, because the community of people who are awake to these patterns is exactly the kind of community both Kardec and Nostradamus said would carry the world forward. The next video reveals what Nostradamus wrote about the person who comes after, the figure he described in more detail than almost any other in his entire body of work. Don't sleep on it.